Today's society is all about
growth.
40 years ago, China's GDP hovered around only $150 billion.
The government reported today that the economy in the second quarter of this year grew at an annual rate of 4.1%.
We've just learned that Australia's GDP increased by 3.4%.
GDP per capita has increased tenfold.
And the last year, GDP had grown to over $12 trillion.
India is now the fifth largest economy.
We are the economic envy of the entire world.
more money, more stuff, more spending. How long can it last?
Nothing in nature grows forever, except a cancer. I mean, that doesn't grow forever because it destroys its host.
20 people are now reported missing.
There are the signs now, the beginnings of what would be a catastrophe.
Deadly and devastating flash flooding swept through New York.
More than 2,000 people are dead.
Stephen Hale is one of the world's leading modern monetary theorists. He explains how our relentless focus on economic growth has come at a price.
It's not just that we're not moving towards sustainability quickly enough. The global economy is growing so quickly that our ability to produce and consume things without damaging the environment isn't growing fast enough to keep up.
He shows how policymakers around the world are getting it so wrong.
Don't ask economists what's safe to do as far as the environment. You have to listen to natural scientists.
Stephen proposes a radical solution for the future of our planet. It means a total shift in the way we approach economics.
We need to stop expanding our economy.
The future might seem pretty bleak, but Stephen is optimistic.
The call to action is we can still do something. We still have time. Our challenge is to make sure that my generation is not the luckiest generation in human history.
Wherever you stand on the climate debate, this conversation will get you thinking. Welcome to The Thought Follower. I'm Joe Mackay. I've always had a lot of questions about life, and this show is my quest to find some answers. Each week, I'll chat to a thought leader to hear what's going on in their space. Let's jump into the next episode. My guest on the show today is an economist and lecturer at Modern Money Lab. He's an adjunct associate professor at Torrens University, Australia. He's author of a book called Economics for Sustainable Prosperity, and he's one of Australia's leading modern monetary theorists. Stephen Hale, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on, Joe.
It's an absolute pleasure. I studied economics at university. I've forgotten a lot about it, but it did always stick with me as a pretty good subject matter that explains a lot of why we are the way we are and how the world works. Maybe just to start things off, how would you describe what you do at Modern Money Lab?
Modern Money Lab is a charity which I set up with some colleagues a couple of years ago after I left the University of Adelaide. The reason for setting up Modern Money Lab was that I couldn't interest the University of Adelaide or any other G8 uni offering the kind of education essential to address the problems that we're going to face across this century. And we ended up in partnership with Torrens University. A year ago, we started running our global online master's degree in the economics of sustainability. And the focus is on two elements of what I think is important this century. One is ecological economics, learning to live within our planetary boundaries while we still got time. And the other one is modern monetary theory, which is the first serious challenge to orthodox macroeconomics in 70 years, what we regard as a realistic description of the mechanics of modern monetary systems rather than 100-year-old ones.
Key thing that I remember about orthodox economics is this idea of growth. There's an infinite ceiling for growth. And what I hear when you talk about ecological economics and this idea of planetary boundaries is that that assumption is actually incorrect. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, the way our economies are organised at the moment, we're well beyond that ceiling. That is not to say that we have to revert to a much lower standard of living to relax the ceiling. Environmental economics sits within the orthodox or mainstream or neoclassical school, and it basically says that we ought to be able to identify the costs and benefits of different degrees of global warming over pre-industrial times. And we know enough about the economy and the environment so that we can come up with an optimal carbon tax. Then patterns of consumption and production will change and technology will evolve and we'll be able to keep growing the economy forever. Ecological economics says, no, that might make some difference. For example, enhance the rate at which we move towards electrification. But there'll always be some limit there, which is set by physics. On the scale of our impact on the environment, which is sustainable and which isn't going to put us on a train ride to collapse. Now, there are various ways of measuring sustainability, but one which has become very influential was identified by some of the world's leading Earth system scientists. One of the people that developed these planetary boundaries was a very well-known Australian ecological economist called Will Stephan. Those 9 planetary boundaries relate to, yes, carbon emissions and climate, but also the rate of extinctions, chemical pollution, biogeochemical use, land use, water use, ocean acidification, air pollution, and the hole in the ozone layer. Those are the 9 that they identified that we get in trouble if we don't live within. In 2009, we were outside 4 of those boundaries. In 2023, we were outside 6 of the 9, and we'll soon be outside 8 of the 9. The only one that we're doing well with, where we're moving in the right direction, is the hole in the ozone layer, thankfully, which something was done about. But the other 8 planetary boundaries we're in trouble with. And this is something that we need to take seriously, and that, in our view, neoclassical economics and policymakers and both sides of politics really aren't taking seriously yet in Australia, but globally.
What does modern monetary theory have to say about this situation that we're in?
I talk to ecological economists about modern monetary theory, and I talk to modern monetary theory economists about ecological. When you talk to ecological economists, your message is you can't ignore how the monetary system works. If people tell you that renewable energy is unreliable or it's very expensive to make it reliable and governments can't afford to do this kind of thing, well, that's technically not true. What we need to be thinking about is how we organise doing that kind of thing, and indeed shifting what we target in economic policy away from growth in real GDP and towards well-being and towards living sustainably. And the issue that you need to manage with government policy is really inflationary pressures. It's not finding the money. Finding the money is never in itself a problem. We can demonstrate that. To MMT economists, I say modern monetary theory was once seen as a more efficient way of growing economies faster. If you go back 20 years ago, when it was first developed. And people think of 3% economic growth as a sign of a healthy economy. Well, an economy that's growing in scale at 3% per annum doubles in size every 23 years. It gets to be 20 times as big across a century. And if we go as far into the future as Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations is in the past, 250 years, that implies multiplying the scale of our economic activity by 1,000 times. This is not going to happen. It's not something which is being addressed at the moment, but we have to move towards a sustainable, steady state. Nothing in nature grows forever, except a cancer. So we need to be thinking about how we use our monetary system in the years to come to go through a period of growth when we're investing in the infrastructure of a post-growth economy where we have a different emphasis. We look at improving living standards in other ways, where if productivity increases, we take those increases in productivity in shorter working weeks or shorter working lives. We're thinking about providing people with economic security and the means to enjoy a higher level of well-being, but not more and more and more products that they don't actually need, and we have to spend a lot of money marketing to persuade them to buy in the first place. We have to make that transition in the next generation. And if we don't, then we're going to see climate events like we see happen at the moment become much more frequent and much more severe. At some point in the next few years, people are going to turn around and they're going to say, okay, you've been complaining about these things for a long time. What could we possibly do to address them more quickly? And that's really part of the reason why we're offering our master's degree globally, because there is a shortage of ways in which people can have the appropriate training to address the issues that are going to arise in the next generation.
Hey, it's Joe here. I hope you're enjoying the episode. Every chat in season 1 of The Thought Follower is very different. I've talked to creatives, economists, elite athletes, CEOs, venture capitalists, and a bunch more along the way. You never quite know what you're going to get, so make sure you subscribe or follow wherever you get your podcasts and make sure you don't miss an episode. Let's get back to the chat. Imagine you were in the hot seat, whether that's Prime Minister of Australia or advisor, whatever it might be. Imagine if you had the power. What are some of those actionable things you talked about that we should be doing to address this more quickly?
Well, some of them are happening, but just need to happen a lot faster. No, I wouldn't be a politician, and it wouldn't be up to me to make the decision. It would be up to people like me to assist politicians to come up with options. But the first thing that politicians around the world have to start talking about is that we have to stop seeing the expansion of inflation-adjusted gross domestic product as a sign of success, because it isn't. There's loads of evidence, and there has been since the 1970s, that in already rich countries, increasing real GDP does not improve people's subjective reported life satisfaction. And there are all sorts of objective measures of well-being that don't seem to be closely associated with GDP per capita in already rich countries around the world. Measures like life expectancy, literacy rates, crime rates, homelessness, there's all sorts of things which are more closely related to inequality than they are to real GDP. Now, that's not true in poor countries. It's not even true in most middle income countries, but in countries with a GDP per capita above that of about Estonia, which is far below Australia, then there really isn't much of a payoff to increasing people's income per head over time on average. We have a big enough economy in Australia to provide people with a good quality of life and to give us the wherewithal to improve things over time. So we're not talking about a static economy. If we talk about a steady state one, we're talking about a qualitatively improving steady state economy where over time our overwhelming drive is to move back within our planetary boundaries. If people want a single statistic for policymakers to focus on rather than gross domestic product, we do have a candidate. It's called the Genuine Progress Indicator. It is an attempt to look in dollar terms, the costs and benefits, economic and social and ecological, of economic activity, and to identify whether growth in scale in a community is genuinely economic or not. Because if the costs of expanding the economy are greater than the benefits, then really we shouldn't call it economic growth, we should call it uneconomic growth. And a measure like GPI, if our politicians had to report on it and were judged by it, would mean that they'd have to put much more emphasis into things like addressing climate change more quickly than is the case at the moment. Some things are happening. We now have our government having a measuring what matters framework. So they are beginning to report as part of a transition to wellbeing budgets on a wider variety of factors than in the past. But they're not really putting much of an emphasis on that. So if you ask Anthony Albanese, is Australia doing well as far as the economy is concerned? Well, he might talk about inflation and unemployment. But the other thing he'll talk about is how quickly real GDP is increasing. Yeah. The most important thing is we need to address well-being and improvements in well-being rather than growth per se.
And so I want to go back to that point because that for me feels like the core of the whole issue. More is not better.
Yeah, there's a great book which was published a couple of years ago by an LSE anthropologist called Jason Hickel, which is a bestseller. It's called Less is More. If you want to learn about ecological economics, there's a book by Kate Raworth called Donut Economics, which I strongly recommend, which has popularized ecological economics. If you want to learn about the degrowth movement, then the book to read is Less is More, which starts off by looking at the extent to which our environment globally has been deteriorating in relatively recent years. It starts off very depressing, but ends up with a call to action, a bit like what I was just talking about a few minutes ago, and is empowering and is an incredibly influential book amongst young people in the climate action movement.
To me, this is where I see the link between the macro and the micro. It feels like human nature that we want more for ourselves.
But it isn't. Economic growth is a very modern concept. Modern economic growth started in 1950. We didn't even measure the scale of the economy before 1900. Gross domestic product wasn't invented until the 1930s. Only 9 countries had ever tried to measure the size of their economy before 1900. The concept of economic growth didn't even exist. But yes, in those days, there was, of course, absolute poverty and obvious benefits to growth. And the scale of our ecological footprint was tiny compared to the biocapacity of our planet. Even in 1950, according to the Global Footprint Network, our footprint was only 0.5 of the biocapacity of the planet. By 1970, They tell us that our footprint equaled the biocapacity of the planet. What that means is that the last time the global economy was ecologically sustainable was in 1970. Just before the pandemic, it had got up to 1.7 planets. We needed 1.7 planets in order to not overwhelm our waste sinks and not use up renewable resources like forestry and fishing more quickly than they could be renewed, and not use up non-renewables more quickly than we can develop renewable alternatives. During the pandemic, that went down from 1.7 to 1.6 Earths. It's now gone up to 1.75 again. It's not just that we're not moving towards sustainability quickly enough. It is that we've achieved globally what we call relative decoupling. The economy grows more quickly than our impact on the environment does. We're getting better per dollar at living within this planet. But the global economy is growing so quickly that our ability to produce and consume things without damaging the environment isn't growing fast enough to keep up. So our impact on the planet is still getting bigger. There are the signs now, the beginnings of what, by the end of this century, if we don't address it, would be a catastrophe.
So coming back to this idea, whether we've been measuring it or not, for centuries there have been people in civilizations who've wanted more from themselves, people who want to conquer new territories and take over kingdoms.
The idea that for people who are already wealthy, as we are, that we are going to have a higher level of well-being if our income is even higher than it is at the moment. For the mass of us in the country, this is simply not true. It's something that we believe to be true. Partly it's something which has been sold to us, but we can measure these things. And if you're already well enough off, an increase in your income, if people ask you how satisfied you are with your life for a year or two, you say you're happier. But 5 years later, you're not happier anymore. You're back where you started.
How do we get that through our heads? Like, we see the data, there's that sensation that's there, but somehow for the majority of us, it doesn't change behaviour.
We're going to be hit on the head with it in the next decade. This is just around the corner. A good thing to say, though, is we're not at the point where we can't do anything about it. We have amazing technology and amazing human ingenuity, and we can address the problems that we face at the moment. Otherwise, I wouldn't be bothering doing what we're trying to do. It's just that we need to sit up and take notice. You know the movie Don't Look Up? We are living that movie. We really do have a huge rock heading towards us at the moment. For example, I mentioned the new research, planetary boundaries. That should have been the number one news item on the ABC News, everywhere else. It didn't make the news at all. I heard an interview about it, ABC News Radio in the morning, which was great, and the journalist was terrific. But then I was looking at the TV news in the evening, and I can't remember what the first item was, but it wasn't anywhere. Here's something that's easy for people to remember. In order for the concentration of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in our atmosphere to not continue rising, we need our net emissions to be zero. As yet, our emissions globally keep rising. It's not just that they're not zero, it's that they're moving in the wrong direction. Earth system scientists, generally speaking, say that to have a safe climate system, we need to stabilise greenhouse gases in our atmosphere at 450 parts per million or below. We went beyond that in 2003. At the moment, the concentration in the atmosphere is 510 parts per million, and it is continuing to go up by a couple of parts a year. So we are beyond what is safe, and we're heading in the wrong direction. Shifting to renewables, all your technological gizmos, everything on its own will not allow us to address this credibly without questioning that growth imperative and starting to think about what's enough rather than how much do we need? How much actually makes us happier, and to what extent are we consuming all sorts of things? Do we have whole sectors of our economy which we don't really need? Don't ask economists what's safe to do as far as the environment, because they don't know about this. They're the wrong people to ask. William Nordhaus got the Nobel Prize for Economics in 2018 for a model which in its initial form said that 4 degrees of global warming was optimal. Will Stephan, the late climate scientist that I mentioned earlier, used to say 4 degrees of global warming is not consistent with the long-run survival of large mammals, including humans. Economists have a tendency to make extremely unrealistic assumptions and then build mathematical models based on those unrealistic assumptions and get conclusions at the end which policymakers are then intimidated into taking seriously. But sometimes economists are not the right people to talk to. Where you should talk to economists is about once you've discussed with the natural scientists and the engineers what we need to do, all right, how do we go about organising this and financing it in a way which doesn't destabilise the economy and takes issues like inflation risk seriously? That's where economists should come in.
Hey, it's me again. If you made it this far, I'm guessing you're enjoying the chat. Don't forget to give the Thought Follower a rating and share it with your friends. Otherwise, reach out to me on LinkedIn with any guest suggestions or feedback on the show. I'd love to hear from you. Let's get back to the episode. So your book is around sustainable prosperity?
It is, but actually I wrote that book in 2016. Things are moving so quickly that if I was to rewrite the book now, there'd be a lot more about ecology and a lot more consideration of contributions from degrowth scholars than there was at the time, because I knew less about this then, but actually the urgency. And this is where things are going to change in the next few years. This is an issue or a set of issues which is moving incredibly fast, faster than most people's ability to catch up, because we're not surrounded by this day to day, the obsession that we have on the evening news. The day-to-day obsessions that we have are unhealthy, some of them, and they divert us away from worrying about the long term. For example, God forbid, but if we have a bad bushfire season, attitudes towards these issues will be different by next March. This is a very rapid area of change. Human civilization has only been possible for the last 12,000 years during the Holocene, where the average surface temperature on the planet has gone up or down by only 1 degree. In the last generation, we've kicked ourselves out of the Holocene. We're not in the climate of the last 10 or 12,000 years anymore. People haven't noticed yet. We've already gone beyond 1 degree of global warming, and we can see the effect of that. We are on track to have 2.5, 2.7 degrees of global warming by the end of the century. And nobody, not even the Earth system scientists, know what world that's going to kick us into.
It's a huge subject matter and very complex, but I think what really helps is an analogy, a metaphor, and one that I've come across in researching this has been this idea of donut economics.
Yes.
Like, how can we do this sustainably? Could you explain what's the analogy of the donut in economics and how that works?
Donut Economics is the title of a popular book by an English economist who used to work for Oxfam called Kate Raworth, who has become very famous as a result of publishing this book. There is a website for the Donut Economics Action Lab, and a number of cities, particularly in high-income countries, city councils have started to use policies suggested by the donut to guide council policies on things like housing and all sorts of things related to the environment. Amsterdam is the city that's taken that furthest so far, but there's Portland and Pennsylvania in the US. What Kate did was, first of all, she became aware of those planetary boundaries that I mentioned before. And you can represent those planetary boundaries, as the Stockholm Resilience Centre does, around a circle. Around the rim of the circle, you divide the circle up into 9 segments, and those segments, or wedges, relate to the 9 planetary boundaries. So some scientists said was, if we're going to have a sustainable environment, we need to stay within that circle. And Kate's insight was to see that, well, if you're at the middle of the circle, if you're not using any of the Earth's resources, if you're not generating any waste, you're going to starve to death. We need to use the Earth's resources for food, for housing, to make sure people have a decent quality of life. So what she did was she drew another circle inside the planetary boundaries. And that other circle was about sufficiency. And she identified 12 elements that you can identify. You know, how much energy do people need? How much food do people need? How much access to water do people need? What do we think is important as far as housing, inequality, and some other things that are more difficult to tie down, like political freedom and equity, including gender equity, drawing on United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. That gave her the inner ring of the donut. And the idea was that every society should aim to get beyond that inner ring, because if you're not beyond that inner ring, you're not providing people with what they need for a good quality of life. But you have to stay inside the outer ring. If you can do that, you are in the safe and sustainable but adequate ring of the donut. What researchers at the University of Leeds have done is they've actually tried to apply the donut globally, and they've published data on how well 150 countries are doing in terms of getting into that ring of the donut where everybody should be. And the bad news is that of 150 countries around the world, 150 of them are failing to be in that ring of the donut at the moment. But the country which comes closest is Costa Rica, in terms of meeting the needs of its population while not living outside our planetary boundaries. On a per capita basis, the high-income countries, they meet virtually all of those needs. In Australia's case, we meet all of them except one. We have a bit too much inequality, but the others we do well on. Unfortunately, on a per capita basis, of the 150 countries surveyed, on average, Australia is the one which is furthest away from sustainability. But there are two other groups of countries. There are the great mass of countries, which are low or very low income countries, which are living sustainably in the sense that they're not outside the planetary boundaries. I don't know how many millions of people there are in Africa this is true of, but a lot of people in that continent don't have access to energy at all. So they're living sustainably, but they're not meeting people's basic needs. They don't have an adequate life expectancy. There's all sorts of other ways. They don't have adequate nutrition, guaranteed access to nutrition anyway. And then there's a third bunch of countries, which include places like Brazil and Argentina and Russia, where they're not meeting people's basic needs on average across the population, but they're not living sustainably either. And those countries tend to be countries with very high levels of inequality and all sorts of structural problems. So you've got three types of countries, and they all need to change. We shouldn't ever distinguish between developing and developed economies, because on this measure, there are no developed economies. We all need to change, but it's just we all need to change in a different way. If you're talking about Niger, there are lots of ways in which they need to expand their economy, but they can't expand their economy over time the way we have, because we've used up all the ecological space. So they have to do it in a different way. For example, not relying on fossil fuels. But if you're talking about Australia, once you've made the investments, we need to stop expanding our economy because we've used up everybody else's. We've got 510 parts per million CO2 equivalent in the atmosphere. We can't be adding to that indefinitely, otherwise it's going to undermine everything. So there is a positive message here. We know, roughly speaking, what each of these three groups of countries needs to concentrate on over the next generation. You sent me some questions before we started this, and one of the things you sent me asked me about what I'm doing in my own life as far as disability is concerned. I prefer not to answer that question. And the reason I prefer not to answer that question is that it encourages sort of shaming, and this is a systemic problem. It's great whatever people can do individually to change their way of living. But the bad news is that's not going to change the situation. This is a macro problem. This is something which the pressure for change has to come from the bottom up, because the politicians won't take this seriously until we make them. But the actions that matter are going to have to come from the top down.
So with that, the planetary boundaries and the ecological situation there, the emergency that's there, how do you sleep at night?
Notwithstanding bushfires in Australia, because we're a high-income society, well, we're not the ones feeling the main impact of this at the moment. But we are going to see around the world, and we're already seeing increasingly frequent, severe problems across low and middle-income countries. But this has been going on for years. Political instability in Northern Africa, one of the contributors to that has been climate change. The refugee crisis in Europe, climate change. We're going to have a refugee crisis of our own. The biggest mistake he ever made, Peter Dutton, was joking to Tony Abbott once about Pacific Islands disappearing under the sea, because that's precisely what's going to happen in the next couple of generations. And these issues we need to address. Where I'm living now is going to become more dangerous. Flood-prone areas during La Nina years in eastern Australia are going to become very difficult to insure, if they're not already difficult to insure. So these are the kind of problems that are going to become more and more obvious to us. We still have time to address these issues, and we probably are addressing these issues quickly enough to avoid human extinction, but that's a very low bar. We want to avoid hundreds of millions of people dying prematurely. We want to avoid increasingly frequent severe climate events. We want to avoid the unknown risks which come with mass extinctions. 70% of the mammalian wildlife which existed on this planet when I was born no longer exists. But the call to action is we can still do something about it. It's not that we are doomed to extinction. That's not what I'm saying at all. It is that we face challenges which no previous generation has ever faced, or I should say, people much younger than me face challenges that no previous generation has ever faced. And our challenge is to make sure that my generation is not the luckiest generation in human history, that things don't go backwards. We don't need to return to living in those pre-monetary communities. And we're not talking about getting rid of modern technology. We're not even talking about a lower level of well-being. We're talking about a higher level of well-being. But we're not going to get there without addressing very soon many of the things which for the last 40 years have been taken for granted. I think that's going to happen. There are going to be changes. It's just a question of which direction the changes go in. The monetary system, my description of it, nobody would ever argue with the details because it's just descriptive. But as far as climate change is concerned, that's to do with physics. It's not to do with whether you're in the Liberal Party or the Labour Party. So we need to get beyond this being seen as a partisan issue. The Prime Minister, get the world's leading climate scientists together in Canberra, have some discussions, come out with a plan for how we're going to transition Australia to net zero. Not by 2050. The world as a whole might be able to avoid the worst possible outcomes if it does it by 2050. But that means countries like Australia need to be aiming for 2040. We need to be doing this more quickly than we're planning to do it at the moment, and we need to use our monetary system in an intelligent way to bring it about.
Stephen, thank you so much for all that insight. There's so much in that. My head's going to be spinning for a while, I think.
2 books to read, Donut Economics and The Deficit Myth.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much for joining the show.
That's all right, no worries.
Thanks so much for listening all the way to the end. I hope you enjoyed the episode. If you'd like to support me or the show, best way is to subscribe or follow wherever you listen to podcasts. And please get in touch with me on LinkedIn. Love to hear from you with any guest recommendations or feedback on the show. See you on the next one.